When the king died, Versailles reeked. His breath stopped in a gilded bed. His skin, bloated and blistered, cracked open with the pus of untreated smallpox. The air turned rancid, mirrors were shrouded, doors sealed. Courtiers ran, not out of grief but out of horror. Embalmers refused to touch him. Priests rushed his rites. Even Madame du Barry, his beloved mistress, was dragged away in disgrace before his final breath. Louis XV, once called Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved, died like a peasant struck by plague, alone, disfigured, unmourned. This is not just the death of a man. This is the slow, stinking collapse of a monarchy. The moment a crown turned to rot, it began with hope. In 1715, as the Sun King, Louis XIV died after 72 years of absolute rule. All of France turned its eyes to a child, a 5-year-old boy with golden curls and a royal name. Louis, the great-grandson, an orphan born of tragedy, handed a throne before he could hold a sword. They called him a miracle, a promise, the symbol of France's future. Gentler, wiser, more human than the tyrants of old. But promises are fragile, and time is cruel. Louis XV would reign for nearly 6 decades, long enough to inherit his great-grandfather's throne and destroy his legacy. What began as adoration slowly curdled into contempt. What began as potential dissolved into paralysis. And when it ended, the people rejoiced. His story is not one of sudden collapse, but of slow, decadent decay, a crown that rusted from the inside. A man who lost not a war nor a battle, but the love of his own people. This is the story of how Louis XV died before he ever reached his bed, and how France's rot began not with revolution, but with perfume, politics, and pus. The boy was too young to grieve what he'd inherited. At 5 years old, Louis XV became the King of France, crowned not by thunder or triumph, but by silence. His great-grandfather, Louis XIV, the Sun King, had died after 72 years of iron-fisted splendor. France, exhausted from war, famine, and absolutism, looked to the child and saw relief, innocence, a reset. He was raised not by parents, both lost to smallpox, but by ministers, courtiers, and clerics. Under the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, France exhaled, policies loosened, philosophers flourished. The boy king, kept behind velvet curtains, grew in the golden light of a kingdom desperate for gentleness. Louis was not unintelligent. He studied Latin, science, history, the art of war. Tutors praised his memory, his manners, his quiet charm. He showed signs of grace, not the brilliance of a conqueror, but the poise of a thoughtful man. And when he came of age in 1723, the nation held its breath. They called him Le Bien-Aimé, the well-beloved. The name echoed through salons and marketplaces, stitched into tapestries, whispered at court. He was young, handsome, hopeful. France saw him not as a monarch, but a mirror, reflecting their dreams of a kinder crown. In 1725, he married Maria Leszczyńska, daughter of a deposed Polish king. She was older, devout, politically harmless. Their union wasn't passionate, but it was stable. She bore him children, avoided scandal, and never challenged the machinery of power. For a brief season, all seemed well, but kings do not stay boys forever. Louis, now surrounded by sycophants and shielded from hardship, began to drift. Governing bored him, ceremony exhausted him. He preferred hunting to councils, laughter to policy, and women, always women, to war rooms. Behind the formality of Versailles, pleasure began to take root like ivy across crumbling stone. Enter Madame de Pompadour. She was unlike any mistress before her, refined, educated, brilliant. She became not just his lover, but his confidante, his political advisor, his curator of culture. Under her influence, the arts flourished. The Enlightenment glimmered, but so did resentment. The nobility seethed. She was bourgeois, female, powerful. Her presence in the king's private chambers and public councils scandalized France. Yet Louis clung to her like a drowning man to driftwood. Her salons became shadows of power. Her whisper carried more weight than most dukes. Meanwhile, Louis's indecision deepened. He wavered in war, dithered in diplomacy, and numbed himself in the endless distractions of Versailles. The people began to murmur. The love that once crowned him started to wither. His face still adorned coins and paintings, but in taverns it was mocked. The well-beloved had become the well-removed. The king's light was dimming, even as the chandeliers of Versailles still sparkled. He still wore the crown, but beneath it something had already begun to decay. The first cracks didn't shatter the throne. They whispered through the marble. In 1740, the War of Austrian Succession began, a contest of dynasties, alliances, and fragile egos. France, under Louis's banner, joined the fray, But while soldiers died in fields soaked with blood, the king remained in silk-draped chambers, more concerned with hunting routes than strategy. The war dragged on for 8 years. No true victory, no lasting peace, only cost, thousands dead, coffers bled dry, and the people, restless. Madame de Pompadour tightened her hold on the court. She appointed ministers, advised military campaigns, even curated royal architecture. Her salons pulsed with influence. To Louis she was safety, the only one who never judged him. But to the nobles she was an infection, proof that the king no longer ruled, only reclined. Then came the 7 Years' War. France bled again, this time against the British Empire, and this time the humiliation was total. Louis lost Canada, Louisiana, and control of India. Entire empires slipped through his fingers like wine through lace. French pride was shattered, the navy in ruins, trade routes strangled. The people paid, always the people. Taxes rose, bread vanished. Meanwhile, Versailles glittered. The king built the Petit Trianon, a pleasure palace, gifted to Pompadour, later to du Barry. A monument not to power, but to escapism. The starving watched as marble was carved into fantasies, and the crown retreated behind gilded gates. Resentment turned to rage. The nobility, protected by privilege, refused to pay tax. The church hoarded wealth. Parliament, once a rubber stamp, now muttered defiance. Louis responded not with reform, but with suppression, exiling judges, silencing critics, expanding censorship. He believed obedience could be commanded, but obedience, once forced, curdles into resistance. The Enlightenment sharpened its knives. Voltaire mocked the king's vanity. Rousseau questioned the divine right. Diderot, with every printed word, chipped away at the myth of monarchy. Louis could have listened. He could have changed. But instead he turned inward, vanished deeper into Versailles, into routine, into silence. He ruled like a ghost wearing a crown, and outside the palace walls, France rotted. The love was gone, the faith too. What remained was habit, a monarch still seated on the throne, long after the throne had lost its meaning. Louis XV did not fall in battle. He did not lose to revolutionaries. He simply decayed, and the crown decayed with him. It began with a cough, April 1774. Louis XV, now aging and swollen from years of indulgence, arrived at the Palace of Trianon to visit Madame du Barry. The air was still sweet with spring. The gardens bloomed, but somewhere beneath his skin, death had already taken root. Smallpox, the same disease that had taken his parents, had come for him. At first the court whispered reassurances. Just a chill, just fatigue. He had survived worse, but the fever climbed. His limbs ached. Then came the rash, red, angry, spreading fast. The royal physicians lied, as they always did, but the pustules did not. His face, once admired in portraits across Europe, began to swell and weep. The skin cracked. The smell changed. His courtiers came with perfume-drenched handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, but they could not stop the truth. The king was decomposing while still alive. Versailles recoiled. Mirrors were removed so he would not see himself. Even the loyal Madame du Barry was ordered away, exiled from his bedside by pious courtiers who saw her beauty and laughter as poison in the eyes of a dying man. The rooms darkened, curtains drawn, etiquette dissolved. Only the stench remained. The physicians still pretended, injecting tinctures and muttering prayers, but embalmers refused to prepare the body in advance. Priests hesitated at his door. The palace's halls, once echoing with violin and fanfare, fell to a hush of dread. Even the rats seemed to keep their distance, and Louis, once the beloved, once the sun around which all revolved, was now a warning, a grotesque silhouette under silken sheets. His groans turned to gurgles. His flesh blistered and blackened. His servants, terrified, fled in silence. Ministers stood in corners, unsure if they were witnessing a death or an omen. For France it was both. The king who had once danced through masquerade halls was now unrecognizable, his body collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. He had ruled for 59 years, longer than most men lived, but in the end, his reign narrowed to a bed, a wound, a smell. He could no longer speak, and still no one stayed. The crown sat on a table nearby, untouched, unpolished, forgotten, and for the first time in decades, the throne was empty, not by abdication, not by revolution, but by rot. The morning of May 10, 1774, broke without mourning. The windows of Versailles remained shuttered, not in grief but in shame. Louis XV, the king who once commanded adoration, had died in his bed, convulsing, blistered and alone. No royal herald announced the loss. No bells tolled in sorrow. The silence spoke louder than ceremony ever could. He was not laid in state. There would be no velvet canopy, no lines of citizens waiting to kiss his ring, no procession of nobles bowing in reverence. The rot had spread too far. The stench had become unbearable. His corpse, bloated and leaking, had already begun to poison the air. Embalmers declined to touch him. They wrapped the king in linen soaked with herbs, sealed his remains in a lead-lined coffin, and rushed the body from Versailles before dusk. It was not a funeral, it was a disposal. The lead casing was hammered shut as if to imprison the smell or the shame. Even then, the odor seeped through, an invisible procession trailing behind the carriage like a curse. The nobles refused to follow. The court scattered. Windows along the route were closed, streets emptied. It wasn't fear of illness, it was contempt. After decades of war, taxation, and royal excess, the people of France did not mourn their king's passing. They mocked it. In Paris, taverns toasted his death. Caricatures circulated. The man once known as the well-beloved was now called Louis the Unloved. Crowds gathered not to pay respects, but to cheer. Priests offered hasty blessings. No one wept. Even the palace guards, once solemn in their vigil, whispered jokes behind gloved hands. The royal funeral, once a sacred rite of continuity, had collapsed into farce. The cart bearing his coffin trudged through mud in silence, flanked by only a few frightened attendants. What should have been a national moment of reverence had become a final humiliation. The monarchy had never seemed more hollow. In the Abbey of Saint Denis, traditional resting place of French kings, his body was interred without grandeur. There was no golden canopy, no crowded nave, just shadows, the echo of footsteps, and the thick metallic stench of decay still leaking from the seams of his coffin. No king had ruled so long, and no king had died so unloved. What remained of his legacy now passed to his grandson, the young and timid Louis Auguste, now Louis XVI. He stood at 19 years old, pale and unsure, inheriting a throne already infected. The crown passed from blistered fingers to trembling ones, from a monarch who had drained his nation dry to one who would soon drown in its fury. France did not know it yet, but the revolution had already begun, not with a guillotine, but with the quiet, putrid death of a man who once ruled everything, and left behind only rot, debt, and silence. Louis XVI did not die when his heart stopped. He died slowly, over years, in every ignored petition, in every empty council chamber, in every war waged for nothing. He died when he chose silence over reform, vanity over vision, pleasure over principle. His body rotted in 1774, but his reign had already begun to decay long before. In the end, his corpse became a mirror, not of majesty but of what France had become, bloated with debt, cracked with corruption, stinking beneath the perfume of pretense. The oozing pustules on his face, once so admired, became symbols. His skin, split and leaking, was the monarchy itself, infected, too proud to heal, too diseased to survive. He had once been a golden boy, a child on a throne, born into legend, crowned in hope, and France had loved him, worshipped him, but he wasted their love as he wasted his reign, in distractions and affairs, in apathy dressed as ceremony. And so when the people danced at news of his death, it was not cruelty, because his final gift to France was not wisdom, or wealth, or peace. It was a wake-up call. The mask had fallen. The divine monarchy was not divine. It was mortal. It bled. It reeked. It died like a plague victim no one wanted to touch. Years later, when revolution exploded in Paris and the Bastille fell, it would be easy to blame Louis XVI, the grandson, the sacrificial lamb. But the truth was deeper. The rot had begun in Versailles long before the guillotine was ever forged. It began in a bedchamber heavy with incense, in a corpse wrapped in lead, in a funeral no one followed, in a silence that stank. Louis XV did not die as a man. He died as a metaphor, and his body, blistered, bloated, abandoned, became the tombstone of a kingdom that thought it could outlive its sins.